Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight. My name is Sarah Stevenson. I am the Executive Director of the German Film Office, an initiative of the Goethe-Institut and German Films based in New York. Thank you for joining us for a conversation with Jenna Bliss and Lana Lin, two of the filmmakers in our current series, Hours to Heal. The series is co-presented with Maysles Cinema as part of 1 Million Roses for Angela Davis US edition, a project of the Albertinum and State Museums Dresden and the Goethe-Institut New York. Our conversation tonight will be moderated by Kazembe Balagun. It is co-presented by Common Notions, a publishing house and programming platform that advances new formulations of liberation and living autonomy. Please check them out at commonnotions.org and buy a book from them if you can. I want to also thank the team at Maysles Cinema for the collaboration and for their excellent work putting together this series. Thanks in particular to Annie Horner and Allison Lights, and a warm welcome to Aaliyah Blackmore, who just joined the team. Allison?
Hi, everybody. My name's Allison Lights. I am a cinema manager and the programmer at Maysles Documentary Center. Maysles Documentary Center is based in Harlem. We have a cinema, Maysles Cinema, and a education program that offers filmmaking classes in the documentary world to young people in Harlem in the South Bronx. Everything right now is virtual, but we are looking forward to a hybrid future and have many sidewalk screenings coming up. So if you are in the area, please feel free to check us out for those. In regards to this program, we're so excited to have been able to partner with you all, Sarah. I want to echo that. It's been a pleasure working together. I'm very excited to have this series birthed into the world, as they say, and more than excited for this panel tonight. I think it's going to be a wonderful conversation, and one that in a time of so many narrow narratives in some ways around healthcare, that is an important topic to be brought about. So without further ado, I think I'll pass the torch back to Sarah, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Jenna Bliss, an artist and filmmaker in New York. She is currently working on a project about Wall Street from 2001 to the present. Recent films include The People's Detox, on view in our series, and Poison the Cure. Jenna was a studio participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program in 2016-17. Lana Lin is an artist, filmmaker, and scholar whose work examines the fragilities and contradictions of human and discursive bodies, emphasizing the conceptual and poetic capacities of moving image media. She's the author of Freud's Jaw and Other Lost Objects, and has recently completed 3 Missing Letters, a short film concerning postal delivery set at the border between India and China. Lana is an associate professor at the New School in New York. The film Lana contributed to our series is The Cancer Journals Revisited. Kazembe Balagun is our lovely moderator tonight. He is a cultural historian, activist, writer, youngest son of Ben and Millie, and originally from Harlem, New York. From 2008 to 2013, he served as Director of Outreach and Education at the Brecht Forum in New York, where he helped bring together performance art, LGBT history, film, and jazz with Marxism and the Black radical tradition. He's a frequent contributor to The Independent, where he published The Last Interview with Octavia Butler. Kazembe is also a project manager at Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, New York. A quick note to our audience, please feel free to ask Jenna, Lana, and Kazembe questions in the chat. Kazembe will include your questions in the conversation as they come in. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Allison. And I just want to echo everyone's sentiment. It's wonderful to be here, part of this great series, All to Heal, part of the excellent exhibition, 1 Million Roses for Angela Davis, which is currently on view digitally with the Goethe-Institut. But tonight we are joined by the filmmakers, Jenna Bliss of People's Detox, and also Lana Lin of the Cancer Journals Revisited. these two excellent films that look at the intersections of people's power, feminism, healthcare, and radical politics. And certainly in the vein of Angela Davis, whose thought has been illuminated in recent years, specifically around the racial reckoning that's been happening not only in the United States, but also around the world. Certainly, we're remembering 50 years ago that Angela was a political prisoner subject to incarceration, and it was a movement of solidarity that freed her. Specifically, those million letters that we refer to was millions of letters sent by East German school children to the United States, expressing their solidarity to Angela Davis. But these films tonight deal with a sort of form of solidarity around healthcare and solidarity around our bodies. And certainly part of the milieu of the time, the concern around health and healthcare. Well, let's get into it. Let's talk. Jenna, I want to talk about your film, People's Detox. It details the work of the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords taking over Lincoln Hospital and turning it into a detox center based on people's power, community control, and alternative medicine. Can you talk a little bit about how hospitals became a site of struggle during that time?
Yeah. So I think, and also hi, thanks for having me here. I think that, the Black Panthers and Young Lords were, of course, doing a lot of different projects all over. As people like Alondra Nelson have written about, the Black Panthers sort of focus on health with, testing for sickle cell anemia, and then the more, like the breakfast programs, things like that. And the Young Lords were also doing, like, as people probably know, like tuberculosis testing. One of their early, actions was like hijacking a TB or an X-ray truck so that they could bring it into the community in Spanish Harlem and give people X-rays to test for tuberculosis. So these were things that were already happening based on what their communities were saying were the issues. So, this is kind of happening. And then, I can't speak like more broadly about like hospitals, but I can speak specifically about Lincoln Hospital in this way at this time in the 1960s. And there was members of 1199, which I think Madeline Anderson's film kind of outlines the struggle and the strike that 1199 had in a different way. But so 1199 is a hospital workers union, and some radical members of the union sort of separated in the South Bronx and started the Health Revolutionary Unity movement. And so, people in my film, like Cleo Silvers was a very important part of the Health Revolutionary Unity movement. But at the same time at Lincoln Hospital, it was a teacher's hospital. So there's people in training, and there was like also a move within the medical establishment, the doctors and nurses, of kind of a radical kind of this influence from China, the barefoot doctor, kind of being like in the community, wanting to like kind of break down some of the barriers. A lot of that took the form of growing beards and like not like looking like the establishment, but they also started their own collectives, like the pediatrics collective and different ones, and they were working in solidarity with the Young Lords and other groups that, these more kind of like these more revolutionary groups that were kind of all circulating around the South Bronx and Lincoln Hospital at this time. So it was kind of, like a fertile ground for something like Lincoln Detox to start. I don't know if that kind of answered your question, but.
Oh, it certainly does. And I mean, one of the things that, it seems to me that it was, part of it was rethinking what the hospital could do. So the hospital was centered in the community, but at the time it seemed that this hospital was not responsive to the needs of the community. And so there had to be a transfer of power around the hospital. And so the institution had changed. And I think one of the more telling scenes in the movie was two. One, you mentioned Cleo Silvers, and Cleo Silvers taking a young Panama Alba, who was at that time a heroin addict, and showing him how the police were actually selling drugs. But then the other scene was actually the workers themselves who were engaging in the acupuncture and the work of the acupuncture, actually going door to door, trying to become the hospital in the streets. And I'm just wondering, could you talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit, but there was actually a process to that there was a takeover, and then there was actually the creation of this detox center, right?
Yeah, so there was actually like several takeovers, 1199, not 1199, the Health Revolutionary Unity Movement, they had their takeover of like it was like a portion, I'm not exactly, now I'm sort of forgetting the details, but they had a takeover where they, had kind of the first version of the Patient's Bill of Rights. So that was instituted through the Health Revolution, HRUM is what the acronym for it. So that was the first takeover. Then there was the takeover by, really initiated by the Young Lords, where they occupied the hospital for several hours and made a list of demands. And then there was the third takeover, which was a coalition of, the Black Panthers were actually not involved in that as much because they were a little distracted by some other more pressing issues for them, but it was the Young Lords and then and local drug addicts in the area, as well as like HRUM and with the kind of coordination of some of the doctors at Lincoln Hospital, this third takeover took place that they stayed, and they, like basically after they were kicked, like some people were arrested, but then the hospital administration realized that here are these people and they're going to fulfill a need that is a need of the community, but the hospital is not addressing at all. So, these like through direct action, they like started something that was, so the hospital basically allowed it to stay in a way, but it was an antagonistic relationship between the hospital administration and the clinic, because the clinic was kind of autonomous once it got started. And people talk about how like the police were not allowed inside. It was really this like, in the nurses' residence, it was like this kind of autonomous zone within the hospital.
And I think part of it too is also the fact that, the Panthers themselves, as you mentioned, were in the midst of a battle. Their leadership was arrested in 1971. The case was called the New York 21, where the New York City had arrested the top leadership of the Panther Party, including Afeni Shakur, who was the mother of Tupac Shakur, who was pregnant at the time. And there was this kind of connection amongst one of the people who was also arrested was Michael C. Tabor, who wrote a short pamphlet called Capitalism Plus Dope Equals Genocide, which really became like a popular tract in terms of connecting public health, anti-capitalist organizing, and Black liberation. And that's kind of set the tone for some of the work of the Detox Center, right?
Yeah, Michael Sotaweo Tabor's pamphlet was hugely influential on like the kind of ethos and this sort of like push for like a detoxification in order to produce a revolutionary subject. That was really what they were trying to do there.
I want to return back to that, but I want to kind of move forward with like Lana and bring Lana to the conversation. Excuse me. And I was watching the Cancer Journals Revisited, and I mentioned it before we talked. I have a deep connection with Audre Lorde. She went to Hunter College. She actually studied German at Hunter College along with poetry. And you take something that was very kind of one of her most personal writings, and you put it into film, and it's an amazing film. I encourage everyone to watch it. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that where Jenna's film certainly talks about the public struggles of the people in the streets, the Cancer Journal has a similar struggle, but it certainly is within the Black feminist lexicon of the personal is political. And I'm wondering how that became a thread throughout your film. If you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for questions and for moderating tonight. Well, throughout the film, I take Audre Lorde as a lead, and her first part of the Cancer Journals, the memoir, it started from a lecture, and the lecture was The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And that says it all right there. That is her version of a kind of transformation of the personal into the political, the kind of personal assumption of a private suffering and of private silence that you keep within yourself. But for her, she needs to move that outside of her interiority into the public realm, to transfer that into political language and public collective action. In a similar vein, I hope that I'm doing that in sharing my personal story with cancer, but not dwelling on it, not telling my individualized story, but inviting these 27 other people to share their experiences of cancer, and therefore to sort of not be telling their personal stories, but to tell a kind of collective story about healthcare and how society views illnesses like cancer. So I feel like taking the way in which medicine treats the ill as a kind of personal individual experience is a way of depoliticizing that illness. And Lorde was the first person to show us that you needed to kind of come out of your individual state and to, as you brought up earlier, and to be in solidarity with others who, in this case, others who are ill. But Lorde never forgot that the ill are more subject to illness because they are probably subject to other social ills like racism and sexism, homophobia and ableism. So even in her writing in 1980, 1977, 1980, when it was published, she was aware of that health and illness was always politicized.
I love the way that you capture that in the film, and the way that the women's individual, both reading of Audre Lorde, but also their own individual stories, become a collective in a sense. It becomes a chorus, right? And it becomes like a sense of like these different voices that come to bear. And certainly, I mean, I think it really speaks to agency of Lorde at the time, because I can't lie. I cracked up at the scene of like white women dying of cancer in the film. I don't know how you thought of that or how you produced that scene, but there was something about this is new. This was new at the time, right? This is very new for a woman to be talking about her treatment in this kind of open way.
Very new, and still, I think, Audre Lorde is probably the only woman of color, Black woman, who has had breast cancer, who herself is telling this story and making a contribution to the discourse. I mean, I did work on this actually in a dissertation before it became a film, and I really looked for other models, and I was really interested in how Black women and women of color represent themselves in artworks and films. And there really hardly is any model other than Audre Lorde, who had a kind of impact that still resonates today. And I do think that's because she was not only telling her own personal story, as I was saying, that she was really speaking about the effects to the larger community and to the social realm.
Right, absolutely. something that really hit me in both of your films is that, you know, at the point of service where people go to get medical help. Well, let me back up and just say this in point of context. We're in a moment where care is definitely on the agenda. And certainly the terms of care has been popularized. I'm also specifically thinking about notions of like, you know, we call things toxic. You know, we talk about toxic masculinity, we talk about toxic workplaces. We use that term to describe like sickness in our own day-to-day existence. And I'm wondering, like, one of the things that is interesting in your films is that the notion of toxicity shows up in interesting ways through healthcare, right? In the ways that you treat that. I was wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
I guess I'll start since I'm unmuted. In terms of Lord's text in my film, I think that she really had a strong critique of toxic compulsory optimism, which is still relevant today, that within cancer, you know, there's the demand to be continually optimistic, and that actually has a toxic effect on people who actually have cancer, being told that they're supposed to be battling and always happy to be alive and surviving. And the other major critique she had that still is so pertinent today is the kind of toxic sexist demands to conform to certain normative beauty and femininity standards, particularly around breast cancer, that, you know, you have to be two-breasted and those breasts have to be symmetrical, and they define who you are as a woman. So she was very much in advance of her time in criticizing that. And it's still, I think, very hard for especially even Black women to embrace that kind of rejection of the kind of normative beauty standards. I'll just mention that I inquired amongst many people to participate in the film, and I very specifically was looking for a Black woman who was flat-chested, who was not reconstructed. And that was extremely hard to find because, and I totally understand and respect that a lot of Black women are like, we have enough shit to deal with. We don't need another layer of being, you know, considered abnormal because you can visibly see the, you know, effects of breast cancer. So, so I really understood that this was still incredibly provocative.
Jenna?
No, I was just thinking that was an interesting points. But yeah, I mean, I think it's the toxic. I mean, it was a detoxification clinic. So, but I was actually thinking, you know, about what that could maybe mean, because I think there was something about the detoxing at Lincoln Hospital that was, I mean, it was in some ways very specific. It was really just getting people off of heroin, and alcohol, cocaine, anything else was actually like, you know, that it was specifically about heroin, because heroin was like considered antisocial. It was not helpful for the movement. It was debilitating towards the movement, is what I understood from the research that I had been doing and speaking to people. And so it was a certain sociality that was being sought after, but then at the same time, their kind of understanding of, you know, there was kind of a shift. At first, it was like taking methadone on a 10-day detox, like methadone for 10 days and decreasing dosages to help people ease their way off of heroin. Then the methadone was replaced with acupuncture. And that brought in, I think, a much more like holistic sense of what are toxins. And then and also a real criticism or like critique of the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry, and kind of a real questioning of what is, you know, the poison and what's, you know, yeah, I don't know if it's so hard with Zoom. You just can keep talking in a bubble, you know, everyone else is.
No, keep talking. This is it. This is keep it. No, you're on a roll. You're like butter on a roll right now. You going. You want to keep going? Go ahead.
Okay.
No. I mean, I would just think that it's, I mean, absolutely. I mean, when you're thinking about, and when you bring up a good point, it's like people come to these hospitals looking to be well, but sometimes like the treatment is, the cure is worse than the illness at times, right? Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I think in both films, this issue around how you be treated is just as important as in terms of what to move. And I think that, certainly some of the Panthers and maybe some of the Lords saw methadone as another replacement drug as bad as heroin, in terms of the ways in which it kind of came through. But that reminds me of something else, which is another thread between the two films. Obviously, at this moment right now, in 2021 and 2020, we've been seeing a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans on the streets of the United States, in New York City and San Francisco, where Asian American brothers and sisters are living. But I think that the times in which you were speaking of were also this interesting period in which there were illustrations of, intercommunal solidarity, in ways that were like unimaginable, that were just like wildly imaginative, in terms of like building new forms of community. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about like how Asian influences or Asian American influences, both personally but politically, like shape the course of both these organizations and people and your own work in terms of how it shows up.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was interesting because they were like at Lincoln Hospital, or Lincoln Detox, they were really influenced by Mao, the writings of Mao, and a part of also a part of their program, it wasn't just the literal detoxification, the bodily detoxification, it was also a political education. And that was thought to be, just as an important part of kind of treatment for addiction as the methadone or the acupuncture. But they were really influenced by the teachings of Mao and the kind of idea behind the barefoot doctor, and that idea originating in China. And I think, though, it's interesting at the same time, though, because I think that there was kind of an idea of medicine in China with that. I mean, they actually, it is interesting. Initially, it was like kind of the idea of it, and there was some members like Walter Busquet talks about going down to Walter Busquet del Rio talks about going down to Chinatown, talking to acupuncturists down there. But of course, those were people that were not communists or trying to, start a socialist revolution like the Young Lords were. So there was an interesting kind of political rupture, but then this like teaching was able to happen. But then they did end up there at Lincoln Hospital. They started an acupuncture collective. So everyone had different roles, and they did visit China at some point. So there was an actual exchange of technique and teaching. So.
Lana, sorry.
I'm not sure how to make the connection, although it is interesting that in both films, the kind of role of Eastern medicines. I don't really know what, I mean, I know that ultimately for Audre Lorde, she rejected certain kinds of traditional Western medicine, but she went to Germany and had alternative treatment, but she never went the route of fully Asian Chinese medicine, which I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's probably a good idea. I mean, the philosophy behind Chinese medicine in relation to cancer is really valid, like actually treating the body holistically. But despite the toxicity of cancer treatments, you know, they are effective. So I guess personally, I'm ambivalent about making that kind of separation. Within my film, I show, I mean, it's actually really important. Yoga and acupuncture are really important as kind of supplemental treatment and more for kind of the spiritual health and the sense of well-being. And so I did try to include that because actually, surprisingly, yoga played a really huge part in many people's lives that I was talking to. And so one of the people who was participating is kind of a yogi and started her yogic practice during her treatment. So I kind of highlight that.
You want to know something wild? It's so funny you mentioned it's so funny you mentioned yoga, because when Angela Davis was in prison 50 years ago, she took up yoga.
Yeah.
You know, in prison. You know, and, you know, as part of her recovery and the work that she was doing to keep herself well, you know, under cage. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, Ebony or Jet magazine published one of the first articles about Black yogis, you know, and it turns out there was a whole movement of Black folks who were doing yoga at that time, you know, who were like engaging and doing it, you know, and you think about this is a time of like 1969, 1968, you know, Martin Luther King is assassinated, Malcolm X is assassinated, Fred Hampton's assassinated. A lot of the organizations of that era were falling apart. I think there was a lot of psychic stress amongst activists. And one of the things that the activists did, even back then, was doing a lot of self-care. And this is something that you're seeing today with activists today. A lot of activists are talking about, you know, coming out of Ferguson, coming out of Baltimore, coming out of Minnesota, these rebellions against, you know, racialized capitalism, saying that, hey, wait a minute, we have to organize, but at the same time, we have to be able to take care of ourselves, you know, and the body is sacred. And so this is part of like the work as well. And so something interesting to think about how these movements are actually able to birth something that's so relevant for today, right?
Yeah. Actually, it made me think a little bit also about how this is similar to the People's Hospital, that actually yoga is often offered for free for cancer patients. So it's this kind of people's yoga in a way that, you know, other services aren't. So I don't know, it just occurred to me. But I also wanted to go back a little and just touch on what you were saying about Black and Asian solidarity. I mean, I don't think that Lorde articulated that in particular, although her daughter, Elizabeth Lord Rawlins, did say that Lorde always defined feminism as something that didn't have to do with the color of your skin. And so she was very open to, you know, and not closed to how people looked visibly. And so, I mean, taking that as my kind of guide, it was really important to me to sort of foreground Black women and Black women of all different backgrounds. But I also felt the need to also include Asian women and Latinx because yeah, there's always been, and you're right to talk about right now, there's an increased attention to the long history of Black and Asian solidarity with the Black Panthers. And I was just watching a documentary on Yuri Kochiyama, and you know, the activism today can really learn from the past.
And God bless Yuri Kochiyama, May 19th, 1921. This year will mark the 100th anniversary of her birth. Yuri Kochiyama, who was a friend of Malcolm X, associate there the day that he was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom as a nurse taking care of the slain leader. They shared the same birthday, May 19th. You know, and certainly, you know, these histories are important to understand, because you know, it's you know, the idea of forgetting, you know, we forget these histories, you know, we start at square one again, right? And you know, we're not starting at square one. We have so much to build off of. And speaking of which, I do want to mention, as Sarah had mentioned earlier in her introductory comments, this program is being co-sponsored by Common Notions Press, and they're actually offering a suite of books on healthcare movements. They're looking at the history of healthcare movements yesterday and today. I'm about to drop the links in a few minutes to those texts, and they're actually, I believe that this week they'll be offering a discount on those books. So shout out to archiving movement history or memory. There's some great stuff that's happening in Greece right now during the austerity. People's clinics similar to the Lincoln Detox are being opened up in Greece. And certainly there's a conversation that we had with many of books around feminism and the care economy. So I'll definitely tell you to check it out, and I'll drop the links in a few seconds. Again, we're joined by Jenna Bliss and Lana Lin. They are the directors of the People's Detox and the Cancer Journals Revisited. My name is Kazembe Balagun. I would definitely encourage y'all, if you have questions, to drop them in the chat. You know, and you know, and we will answer them live. Honored to be here. This is such a great conversation. I want to follow up with this idea around archives, and you know, this program is 1 million flowers for Angela Davis, and one of the highlights are these letters that have been written by mostly East German school children in the 1970s for solidarity with Angela Davis. As the story goes, there were so many letters to the judge in California that they actually had to shut down the mail service for a week in California. And these letters were collected and they're now preserved and digitalized. Thank you to the museums in Dresden and to the Goethe Institute of New York. But that kind of reminds me that, you know, in both of your films, there's a kind of like, there's a freeing of the archives. There's a way that the archives dance and work in your films. And I'm just wondering, like, how was it for you to be able to be working through archives to tell the story of these films? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
I'm just going to jump in. I mean, I'm not a researcher and I didn't really know what I was getting into, but it was kind of like this unfolding thing in terms of, in the sense that there were some archives, you know, at the NYU library, the public library had, you know, you can find Palante, the Young Lords newspaper. But so it started looking at those kind of resources and, you know, but then found myself in people's closets where, because a lot of this stuff wasn't like digitized, or it was kind of an imperfect archive. And, you know, people like Johanna Fernandez's book on the Young Lords hadn't come out yet. So that would have been a really helpful resource when I was working. I mean, but the thing that was interesting about it was I was actually in touch with, there was several different people that were kind of interested in this history, and we were all making films. Like he hasn't actually made the film yet, but like a researcher, Carlos Martinez, like got all of these newspapers. I think he got all the White Lightning newspapers, and White Lightning was a group of white addicts in recovery and organizing in the North Bronx. And I used a lot of their archive in the film because they did a lot of cartoons, and it was all very specific about heroin and the pharmaceutical industry. And they were a group in solidarity with Lincoln Hospital. And so sorry, I'm having technical issues. Anyway, so that work just basically kind of like fed, that archive fed directly into the film itself, the fabric material of the film itself. And we, you know, Carlos and I were exchanging material, and Johanna Fernandez kind of basically told me where to find the film that I use a great deal of. So that was very generous of her. And then I passed that along to another filmmaker. So, you know.
I guess I'll pick up on my experience at the archives. I mean, I'm a huge fan of archives. I could just live in the archives and never come out. But the two major archives for Audre Lorde are the Spelman College archives and in Atlanta, and the Lesbian History archives in Brooklyn. The really major papers are at Spelman, and I fold a lot of that archival research into the film, like where you actually see the index card box that was given to Audre Lorde that she took notes on for her poems. And you see her dreads, her locks. So it's quite incredible the kind of material history that is preserved in archives. But I was thinking about what Kazembe said about, you know, freeing the archives and certain things that would not normally be seen that can emerge in a film. Like you wouldn't know that Audre Lorde's hair is actually in the archives, but these groups are there. It was pretty stunning what was there, and I remember seeing a wallet of Lorde's that you actually could see the prescription her doctor wrote inside the wallet. And the other really stunning thing was at Spelman, as Audre Lorde's wedding dress was there. So these wonderful material objects. At the Lesbian History archives, they have smaller collection by far, and it is kind of like what Jenna was saying, like somebody's closet. It's just sort of what was happened to be like put in the closet there. But they had an amazing cardboard box that contained the original manuscript for the Cancer Journal. Back when she called it the Cancer Journal, written in ballpoint ink, not the Cancer Journals, plural, that it became when it was published. And I feel like this little anecdote about this box became really important to me is when I first went there, the box was there, and I took some photos of it just because I thought it was amazing that here was the box with the primary document. But it was a little bit shabby. It was, you know, it's old. And but I think it was at least a year before I came back to the Lesbian History archives, hoping to take video of this container. And it had basically it had sort of fallen apart, and it was just folded flat and put into a hanging file folder. And for me, it's a bit of a kind of metaphor for a lot of things, actually, but a metaphor for the archives. Like it preserves certain things that should be and need to be preserved, but maybe in a different shape. And I don't know, maybe our task as, you know, artists and scholars is to kind of make sure it has that kind of afterlife.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think part of the work of like being an activist and activating the archives, because that's where our power is, right? I feel that, I've been to the Schomburg, and anybody knows that 4 blocks down from the Maysles Cinema is the Schomburg Library. And hopefully one of the tragedies of this pandemic is not being able to go to the archives, and hang out with the ancestors like I like to do. And so, like, if you want to, you can go to Schomburg to the 4th floor and ask for the letters that people sent to Angela Davis, and they have it there. The flowers, the letters in German, in English. They're hilarious. They're sad. They're hilarious. There's one letter I remember saying, when we get you out, Angela, I'm gonna take you out for a steak dinner, some champagne and lobster, the works. It's a celebration in the archives, right? But it's also like a sense of a marking time, which I think is also very important. And particularly now, when we're at this point where like a lot of historical memories being battled over and fought over, these ideas around archives are super, super important in thinking about the past, which is why I'm so appreciative of both your films, because I think both your films are readily accessible for activists to engage in archives and be interfacing with the knowledge that we need to move forward in a lot of ways. So, I mean, again, thankful for that, these interventions. Part of which I think today is that, both of your films land at a very particular time right now where, as I mentioned before, like healthcare is a big issue. Last year we had a presidential campaign where, one of the central demands was Medicare for all. The United States still remains the only industrialized country without universal health care. Certainly the pandemic that's happened has led to a lot of these conversations, renewed conversations around health and well-being, certainly, but also on a personal level, mutual aid groups, things of that nature. As filmmakers, what do you want people to get out of your films for the current moment right now? I know that's a tall ask, but I just want to kind of like move that curiosity. What would you want your viewers to get out of the films for the current moment right now?
I guess since Jenna jumped in for the last one first, I'll jump in now. I mean, I don't think that I don't make films in a prescriptive manner, so it's hard to say, but the easiest thing for me to do is always to invoke Audre Lorde. And I feel like Audre Lorde taught us before that COVID taught us, and it retaught us that healthcare ought to protect the most vulnerable populations, who are typically the Black, brown, and poor and disabled communities, but that it doesn't always do so. And Lorde really insisted, and it's part of the film, that it's every woman's militant responsibility to take care of her own health. So I feel like we need to keep in mind that it is the country's responsibility to protect its vulnerable people, but that it will not necessarily do so, and that we therefore need to be continually vigilant in ourselves and mindful of our own health, and to work in solidarity with others who might be less able to care for themselves. So, we can't presume that the state will take care of us, but we should also not, we should also hold them accountable.
Yeah, I don't know. That's what, yeah, I wish I had a good answer. I think that though the People's Program at Lincoln Hospital was kind of an example of a group actually like seizing the means of reproduction and like of production and their own reproduction in like a very literal way, and that we don't that's not something that even seems, it seems possible now, but I think in a way, I think that it's like a good horizon to have, even if it's an example that wasn't sustained for more than 10 years. it is an example of being sensitive to the needs of a community and letting like a community of people dictate what they need for their health and what, you know, and that, and I think that there's a lesson for, I don't know, I found it to be, I think making the film gave me my own political education and like kind of what's possible and like the kind of imagination and like ingenuity that they showed as a group working across groups and navigating and negotiating and really kind of creating like a new idea of what was possible. I mean, this idea that could be within a hospital a space that the police were not allowed inside of, and that like, and they also, you know, I didn't really put this in the film, but the idea was that you would come in, you know, people would put their guns in a box when they walked in the door, and it was this like other zone. And I think like that, where, you know, you could get help getting onto like welfare, or, you know, get signed up for programs, you know, get kind of like, there was a lot more going on than just detoxification from heroin. There was like a community being formed around the clinic. And so, yeah, I don't know.
You make me think so much about the connection people are making now between health and abolition, and so much conversation that's happening around saying defund the police means more access to services, to healthcare. You know, and when you think about another zone, I mean, you're thinking about so many of these people. I mean, so much of the abolitionist vision has been kind of taking up a utopian space. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's something that, you know, like allows us to think differently. And I mean, I think that, you know, both, you know, utopia, I believe the underlying word is like, is not there. But like, you know, in people's detox, you know, that was actually created. It wasn't there, you know, for a short period of time. And certainly Audre Lorde was creating it there, you know, in her writing and her work. So it's interesting to think about how radical imaginaries in the zone, I love this term, the zone, create such a fertile space to be driven to what we want and what we need. I'm gonna so this is the portion of the conversation where I usually ask folks to ask questions. As I mentioned before, if folks want to like start populating the chat with questions, we will take them. I will take them, and I will post them to our lovely guests, Jenna Bliss and Lana Lin. And you can feel free to ask away. As the questions are being populated in the chat, one question I have for y'all, how do you see the depiction of healthcare today by the mass media? Any thoughts on like how the media portrays healthcare in popular culture?
I'll just chime in, but you know, like, I don't really know. It's also wild what's going on, but I do think it's kind of interesting how it's like right now, in some ways, we are getting universal healthcare for the COVID vaccine. Like, you know, like it's, you know, like COVID testing, like it's like a taste of what it would be like to just have the care you need. In a way, I don't like, and I know that there's probably holes in that sort of thing, but it's just so wild to me. I just get tested all the time because I'm like, I can just walk in and get tested. I don't know. It's just a very different relationship to, like, normally I would just be afraid to go to the doctor because it was going to cost a lot of money. So I'd, you know, I like had like cut myself and I'd just like leave it and then realize I was like, oh shit, I should go take it looked at. But I don't know, it's just, I don't have anything really interesting to say about it, but I had a question actually though for Lana, or like, I just thought it was interesting that we were, you know, like in terms of thinking about the archive, I did find it like really this visceral experience when with Audre Lorde's hair in the box. That was like, so it was really this uncanny moment, or like, and I it was hard to like, there was like a lot there. Anyway, that was just a note, but the question I had was more so about, I thought it was interesting that we both kind of, in these sort of trans-historical approaches to storytelling, seem to be using like film, like actually shooting film, Super 8 and 16mm, to kind of like weave some of that history together. And I was just curious about how you mentioned at the end of the film that this was like stock you had, but I was just curious about it.
Yeah, I mean, it actually was really important to me. Thanks for bringing it up, because there is kind of connection to me with the hair and the film. There is this weird power of the material form, like the material object. And I think it's really appropriate that you called Lorde's hair uncanny, because it is actually a part of her that remains despite the fact that she's passed. You know, so for me, film stock is the only medium that can really express that, because it does have a material life in a way that digitality doesn't. It is material, it can be scratched and it can age, and it does age, and it did. Like, so my kind of project, I usually like to have these kind of arbitrary rules. Like one of the rules was that I was going to shoot the rest of my film stock that I had like carried around with me for like over 20 years in all these different places. So the film stock itself is kind of a mirror to the ways in which our mortal bodies are precarious and also age and are wounded. And I felt that the film could only show that visibly in a way that the digital stuff couldn't.
Michelle mentions that's brilliant. I agree. You know, and that was something that I totally took away from, you know, that mention that, you know, this was like the leftover stock of this film. It was such a poetic moment in a film with so many poetic moments. Folks, if folks want to ask questions of the panelists, and so there's one question I have. When we initiate, and this is from, I'm sorry, let me make sure I get the name correct. Harshal Alakur. If I messed up your name, I apologize. Charge it to my head and not to my heart. When we initiate an intellectual conversation surrounding social impacts and biases related to such subjects, I think it almost always has a mental health angle. Could you talk about consciously handling that angle in your films while balancing the main focus of the narrative? Should I repeat it, or it's in the chat?
I guess unless Jenna wants to speak to that. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about cancer, it always has a mental health aspect because it's so emotionally wrought. I guess I'm not sure how to respond to that, except that it was very much on my mind in the production that it would be a difficult topic for people to talk about, and that I had to create the conditions where they felt comfortable enough to talk about it. That, you know, what I have for people who haven't seen the film, that I asked people to read a passage from Audre Lorde's text and then to speak to it. And in the reading itself, they actually often grew very emotional because the text is very powerful and visceral and deals with death and dying. So I don't know, I did think a lot about keeping the production itself very minimal, with, you know, very kind of a very supportive environment. We went with as few people as possible, and people would stay outside, and everybody knew that it would be, you know, that they had to, you know, have a kind of very congenial, trusting kind of environment in order for people to be able to like unveil their vulnerabilities.
Jenna, do you want to jump in on this, or you still... Okay.
Yeah, I could just say, in terms of, I didn't know if the question was more towards like how it's represented in the film or in the making of it. In terms of actually making it, you know, there was a lot of, I don't know if it's being clarified now, in the making of it. Okay, so in terms of, yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of, well, there was a lot of skepticism initially when I would just like cold email people that were members of the Young Lords, that maybe thought, you know, Cleo joked that she wasn't sure if I was CIA or something like that. But, you know, I met her by showing up at her house. She invited me to her home in Memphis. And I just, you know, that's how I met Cleo and stayed with her for like several days. And so, you know, but I think that there was like always a, you know, a certain trust, yeah, that has to be gotten to. But, you know, I'm not sure, yeah, if I can really, I mean, of course, in discussing addiction, it's a very, addiction and revolution, it's a really overwhelming topics. And so it's not, yeah, it's still a difficult thing to navigate, really. Yeah. I don't know.
And I think one of the amazing things about, we talk about an archive, and you talk about the physicality of archive, but there's an archive around like the people themselves. And like, you know, and one of the things that I think is really amazing is that in both of your films, the people are centered. I love the flow of movement in people's detox around the Tai Chi, and the ways in which that the dancing happens in the midst of the urban, you know, which shows that people are still, you know, some folks, you know, would say that even though the institution is gone, the institution is within the people. You know, which reminds me of this, like, maybe thinking about the cancer journals, is that you know, one of the terms that, you know, Audre Lorde had, you know, I think after the cancer was like a burst of light, right? This idea that within yourself there is this healing that's happening, right? And so that's remarkable to have that's really powerful to think about, because oftentimes we're simply seen as not, our bodies are not seen as sites of healing or memory or anything. We're just blank slates at times, right? And so I do want to just jump back in. There's a couple more questions that this is a really good question, an important one. What did you all learn about grief and processes we build to deal with it in the making of these projects? Thank you, Allison, for that excellent question. What did we learn about grief?
I can maybe jump in because it's maybe a little less like obvious with mine. I don't know, so I'm just gonna have a more like my project in the sense that I feel like grief came in the loss in the end of the clinic, and like learning about how it was kind of, it went through this transformation, as is joked about in the film, and the transformation being that like most of the leadership that had been affiliated with the Young Lords or the Health Revolutionary Movement or these more radical projects were basically weeded out of the program, fired, relocated to methadone programs. Many of them refused to work there. Walter Bosque Del Rio in the film, quit. And then the sort of grief of a loss of community. And he says in the film, a lot of people without the clinic, not just for its detoxing, but for what it was as a place in the community, a lot of people went on drugs, a lot of relationships were not able to sustain themselves when the kind of roots of this project were kind of gutted. And I think that was a certain grief, a kind of is a part of like a lesson to be learned from the past, as well as something that I think is I learned about like a grief that was like larger than a personal grief, I would say, but like a collective grief or a historical grief or something. I don't know.
I really appreciate what you just said, Jenna, about a collective grief both and a historical grief. I feel like that's relevant to my film as well. I feel like there was a way in which grief could be alleviated by it being collectively spoken about. And collectively spoken about and kind of mediated through Lord's words, which is a kind of mediation with the past. So that kind of evokes what you were just talking about, this kind of historical grief. Like if Lord went through this and I am having this experience, somehow connected to her past, and she survived it in a certain way, even though she actually died, but she survived it through her legacy. But for me, like making the film itself, I mean, I learned many things. I couldn't really sum it up into one thing, but I remember distinctly at the end of this film, which is so laden with words, I was asking myself, what do these words do? And there is a way in which talking, I'm an absolute believer in, the talking cure, that talking can help grief. But I also knew that you also just had to be with it. Like talking could only go so far. And so I tried to express it in the film, is that you just have to live with it.
Yeah, talking can only go so far. You have to just be with it. And and it makes me think a lot of this, like this moment that we're living in right now. We're entering a post-COVID-19 moment almost, in the sense of like the way in which it's being framed. There's as if there's a beginning and end to grief. Which kind of fits into a particular sense around, like, I think one of the issues that we have is that healing requires rest. Rest is not necessarily productive for capitalism. And so in healing from grief, perhaps requires the most rest in terms of how we settle accounts. The settling of the body, the settling of accounts. And there's something to be said about the healthiness of a society that allows grief to be, for grief to have its place. to memorialize grief, to be able to talk about grief. And it seems to me at this point of healthcare, we are also at this point where the part of the healthcare crisis is that we as much as we don't, there's two things we don't want to talk about as Americans, right? We don't want to talk about being sick, and we don't want to talk about dying, right? and then because both of those require a particular type of conversation around productivity, around care, around stopping and thinking for a second, thinking a lot about, a lot of meaning that comes out of that comes out of, like, being sick and being profound, being ill, offering that. But I guess in a lot of ways, that question is also a question around, like, where do we go from here as a marker in terms of, like, being able to have a society in which these things are reconciled with each other, right? And be able to develop, a continuity of, like, both, like, birth, sickness, and death, and being able to have time for grief. So I think that's some of the work that we need to do. Certainly need to think about today, and certainly, hopefully, some of the policies will shift in some ways. I'm just I'm just wondering, just as a series as a whole, both of your films have been, this has been probably a weird time to be a filmmaker, to say the least. The theaters are closed, the venues in which we usually will engage in. How have you guys been doing in terms of, like, audience and engagement around the films? What have been the reaction to the films from your audiences? What are some of the takeaways that you guys received from the people who've seen the films?
I guess I'll respond that. I mean, it's awkward to have Zoom moments, like, even though this is really great to have this conversation, it's a little bit, hard when we're not in person. But I do feel like my film has traveled to places it wouldn't have in this Zoom world, that people can see it, from all over the world. And that's kind of extraordinary. So for that, I've been kind of grateful. And it's not just my film, but I've been able to see people's work that I would never have access to. And so that's a thing that I've been talking with people about, that I hope that once we get back to in-person things, that we could also still retain some of what's, like, the actual benefits of all this online activity.
I mean, my film's actually, I started showing this film in, like, 2018. So it's interesting because I actually think that people are more interested in it now than they were when it came out. So I have more experience with it just being online than screening, and just screened at, like, Spectacle Theater in Brooklyn but that was in 2018. And so it's been kind of interesting that it has kind of had this life recently, or this interest recently, and that, but it also, feels kind of just sort of, I don't know, it's like the difference between film and, like, shooting digital. Like, there's something immaterial about it, this just idea that it's, like, screening and people could watch it, and the stream. But I think I'm happy that people are watching it. I don't know.
I'm happy that people are watching it too. I mean, it's an excellent films and excellent series that have been really deeply exploratory. I can't think of a better place to do it than Maysles Cinema, which has a long history of, like, doing, like, tremendous work around social justice and documentary work, right 4 blocks down from Harlem Hospital. And so I think very powerful work that's going to be centered in the Village of Harlem, whether or not it's in person or online. I really want to thank both of you tonight for an excellent conversation. This has been excellent, a really great segue in terms of like building community around great healthcare practices, into which, you know, both of your films are, you know, deep illustrations of what justice looks like in public. I want to thank both of you for your excellent work and for an excellent conversation. And I'll turn it back to Sarah and Allison to close us out.
Thanks so much, Kazembe. Thanks so much, Jenna. Thanks so much, Lana. It was great. I think we all really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot. And yeah, I just want to thank our audience as well for being here, and have a great evening.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.